Hello, everybody. Welcome to my first lecture on the actual content of our class this quarter. This today I'll be talking about chapter 21 in this book, D. Armand McCullough's Christianity: The First 3,000 Years. I'll be glancing down occasionally at the book to make sure I'm hitting all the main points, but I'll do my best to talk to you, actually talk and not read at you. So this chapter, the main topic, is this concept that you may have heard of or maybe have never heard of called the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is a particular set of ideas and social movements that changed Europe forever, especially in the 17th, 18th centuries and North America as well. The United States of America, actually, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence are some of the key documents of the Enlightenment. In many ways, America is more affected by the Enlightenment than almost any other country on earth. And so, partly because of that, we're somewhat blind sometimes to how important it is and what it actually is. So, to start with, I want to give you some simple definitions for what the Enlightenment is, because people who actually study the Enlightenment will tell you that there are more than one Enlightenment. There are many of them. There's a French, you may have met some of these figures, Locke and Hobbes in England, Rousseau, Voltaire, in France, Kant in Germany. We will meet some of these figures, some of these main spokespersons of the Enlightenment. And their messages were all slightly different. But I would say we're starting with the Enlightenment because the Enlightenment is generally where Christians, not Christians, historians will think about the modern era. When we talk about modern Christianity, modern history, we're really talking usually about using the Enlightenment as a benchmark because it is, especially in intellectual history, because it is such an important key, such an important piece into bringing us where we are today, bringing society into where it is today. The very fact that we can imagine being citizens of a country, but not necessarily tied to a religion, is related very much to what happened during this Enlightenment period. The idea of a separation of church and state, again, in America, in some ways as nowhere else, the first nation on earth to really codify, to really create a formal separation of church and state, something that has, as far as we know, been very rarely attempted and done in human history. Almost always, who you are, who your parents are, your tribe, so to speak, and your religion are tied together. You live here, you were born here, your parents are this way, and to be a good citizen, a good member of the tribe, is to follow our God, follow our gods or spirits or our religion, our rituals. How can we think about secularity? How can we think about an absence of religion? And what does that do to Christianity? As McCullough points out in this book, in some ways, Western Christianity, Western meaning Protestant and Roman Catholic Christianity, because of Western Europe, because of North America, because of that relationship to the Enlightenment, has faced doubts more honestly, more directly than perhaps any other major religious tradition on earth. And again, that's in some ways a blind spot because we're used to the way Christianity deals with doubt and enlightenment. We may assume, in some ways, that, for example, Islam or Eastern Orthodoxy, another branch of Christianity, deals with doubt in that same way. And in a lot of ways, they do not because they have not had the Enlightenment. So my little simple definition for you. So what is the Enlightenment? I would put it this way for our class: Enlightenment is a series of again intellectual and social movements that basically emphasize. The bottom line is they emphasize rationality, reason, and the ability of the common average person to make choices and to make rational decisions in their life to determine their own identity. And that may seem uncontroversial to you, but actually, again, in most of history, this is a very new idea. Most times it was assumed that you are who you are by birth and you continue in this kind of tradition. But we'll see how social and economic movements work together with intellectual movements to give people a new idea of the individual really as a sovereign source, as a source for legitimacy, what it means to be a citizen. All these kind of ideas that, again, we take for granted in modern nations, they come out of this period, and they specifically come out of this Western European and North American experience. Okay, so simply put, again, enlightenment means that the average person, no matter what their education, no matter how powerful or weak they are, how rich or poor they are, every individual has the right to determine to make their own moral choices, to be responsible for them, and that they have the ability by reason to access the same truths that are available to all. So reason, emphasis on individual reason, emphasis on individual choices, and the creation of a new concept of individual. Descartes, if you've heard of this philosopher, that kind of idea, I think, therefore I am, this is very much of a piece with this long conversation that continues through the Enlightenment. Okay, so we will see. All right, we'll try. I hope that makes sense to you. Again, very simply, Enlightenment, common person has reason, common person's will must be respected, is a simple way to put it. And again, this has never been that obvious, even though it might seem obvious to you in this class. If I tell you your opinions don't matter, or your reasons or your rationality are invalid, only people with certain degrees can make moral choices. We should make choices and rules, and other people should just follow. You will probably have a very strong reaction, and I think rightfully so. But part of that is because of you and I, our common Enlightenment heritage. You don't feel like anybody should have the right to dictate your conscience, and even the university that we live in, that we're working in right now. It's all a part of that same assumption that every person has the right and the ability to make their own choices, to access rationality on their own. And we can have this kind of common conversation no matter what our beliefs or tradition or parents or birth, high or low, all these kind of things. They don't matter in a way. All people can have access to this. And that is universal, right? Universal feeds into university. I don't know if you ever knew that, but that's part of how this is all connected. We're all part of this Enlightenment project. And like I said, Jefferson and Washington and Adams and all the founding fathers, they were very much influenced by the Enlightenment. And all the founding documents of America and the way America is structured is in many ways a big Enlightenment project. Okay, so that's overview, what the Enlightenment is, so you know what we're getting into. And now we're getting to the nitty gritty of the actual names and figures and how these kind of things interact with Christianity. I'm not going to cover everything. There are a lot of details. If you have questions, you can ask me. I'm going to try to cover every section, though, at least a little bit. So the first section is natural and unnatural philosophy. And some of the main points here are simply that we should not think, although I've made this point that Enlightenment is a very new period and that came out of Western Christianity, like everything that happens, it has its own history. And it's not like it was beamed down to us from some alien race and was completely different from anything that went before. Actually, one of the points that McCulloch makes is that all religions deal in doubt, and this is true. We don't know any religions in which doubt doesn't have some form, some role, or even other forms of doubt, mockery or light sarcasm, you could say, or contrarian views that are not going along with the mainstream. There is no religion that's completely unified, that doesn't have these minor voices in the time, or it doesn't have even voices that are silenced, but you may say, for instance, give a little example, in any religious service, some people are there, right, because they're 100% in earnest. They really believe everything the pastor says or what the Holy Book says or these kind of things. They care with all their heart about the Torah. That's why they're there. They want to follow God. And then there are people who are there to do networking, who are more interested in catching up with old friends, for whom it's a social event, for whom it's important to do some service to society. Do you see, there's always going to be levels in any sort of religious commitment. All these people may identify as a religion, so we're focusing on Christianity. Let's use Christianity as an example. They may all identify as Christians. They may all say even that they're a certain kind of Christian. They're all Anglicans or non-denominational Christians, but in terms of what their actual beliefs and how they treat them, there could be quite a wide range. And a lot of reasons. And there's always a level of doubt, always a level of question, of buy-in. And so in this long history of doubt, one of the key points is Jews. One of the big questions for Western Europeans, and eventually for North Americans too, is why are there still Jews? If Christianity, for Christians at least, the big question is, if Christianity is right, if Jesus really is the fulfillment of the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament as Christians call it, the real Moses, the prophet that Moses prophesied, why are the Jews not converted? Why are the Jews still Jews? Why do they reject Christianity? And Christians have had a lot of answers for these, but Jews have also had a lot of their own answers, and their very existence creates issues with Christianity. And so different Christian countries have allowed Jews to thrive at certain times. So one of the key places we go is the Iberian Peninsula. Iberia is Spain and Portugal. And for various reasons at different times, that peninsula, that part of Europe was especially tolerant of Jews. And so there was a thriving Jewish community there that was allowed a certain amount of liberty. we could add on to that the fact that um, that science in this period, something that would have been called natural philosophy in its earliest period, is also starting to grow, and there are more and more strands of thought, these kind of doubts between the Jews, and then between this kind of natural philosophy, which is primarily at this point not attacking the church or not attacking Christianity, but just actually Christians themselves. Many of them were Christians themselves who were, for instance, Galileo, who were just interested in observing the natural world. But one of the points of contact that's beginning to emerge is especially in astronomy because of these observations that, unlike what the Bible seems to say, where the Earth is the center of the universe, it seems that the Earth goes around the sun as scientists made more precise calculations of astronomy. And then there's even a third piece, so which we could call esotericism, which is mentioned in the book. Some of these kind of alchemy and uh, different ideas that are kind of slant to Christianity. They're not directly opposed to Christianity. Some of them even try to predict the end times. But all of these places, all of these spaces, whether it's Jews, whether it's natural philosophy, or whether it's these kind of esoteric traditions where they supposedly inspired by Hermes Trismegistus, the kind of a medieval figure or a legendary figure bearing the name of the Greek god Hermes, of course. So these places are spaces that have existed for a while that continue to expand and change their form. We're going to watch them as they change their form and as they make space for, we could say, non-orthodox. For there's always been this space and there always will be, like I said, in religion. There's the official pronouncements, right, what the Pope says, and then there's the practices from the people who believe, right, at 100% buy-in to all the way down through the levels, the people who actually express doubts or have. There's these interesting spaces being made in Western Europe with natural philosophy, with Judaism, with Hermetic knowledge. And some of these come together, some of these very interesting pieces come together in this person named Benedict or Baruch Spinoza, who is a descendant of Jews who come from Portugal and then and end up in this kind of Spanish controlled or Spanish dominated colony, which eventually becomes the Netherlands or Dutch. And what's going on is Spinoza is the first person we really know of to, this is now moving on to this next section, Judaism, skepticism, and deism. Spinoza is the first person we really know of to uh, come up with, at least to the most eloquent, we could say, modern post-Christian person that we know of, and the first to talk about a world in which there is no immortality and there is no God in the traditional sense. And these ideas are controversial enough that he even gets kicked out of the Jewish synagogues that he's a part of. So he himself is a Jew from this Iberian Peninsula in these kind of tolerant Netherlands, in these Dutch places, interested in natural philosophy. He's makes lenses. He makes some of the most precise lenses in the world for telescopes and for other observational purposes. So he's all these kind of things. We call him an early scientist slash philosopher slash Jew. So you see all these pieces kind of coming together. Um, and he makes this argument that basically the universe itself is God. So he has a kind of very, in a way, he'll talk about God sometimes and sound very pious and full of admiration at the wonder and the infinity of God. But what he's really talking about is that, again, if we're going to go far into the future, to give you a little hint, if you've ever heard of Albert Einstein's conception of God, it's very close to that. So I believe Einstein himself said that my God is Spinoza's God. And what it means is that God is the universe in that sense. It's not separate from the universe, but is the universe itself, which of course is a very controversial thing for someone who's following in a Judeo-Christian or even Muslim, although the Muslims are not part of this story right now, but because the traditional belief in God is always that God stands apart from the universe and above the universe, that he creates the universe but is beyond it. To say that God is nothing but the universe, again, you can see why there's now, according to Spinoza, no more immortality. There's no immortality of the soul. There's no sort of miracles. There's no sort of greater judgment. The universe is what it is, and that is all that. That is all that is God. And so, yes, he gets kicked out. He gets in trouble, and this is Spinoza's kind of big idea, which opens the way for many others to move on from Judaism to greater skepticism and deism. It opens the way for many others who are coming at this same kind of idea, creating what I have pointed out is a kind of a secular space for the first time in Christian history in Europe, a space where you could believe in a lack of God, or where you could take away a belief in God and put words to it and put ideas to it and even build a movement around it. And part of that is biblical studies too. So when we're talking about skepticism, some of Spinoza's heirs, we could say that some of them consider themselves still Christians, but they if they were Quakers, for instance, which is a Christian movement that arises around this same time. They said everyone has an inner light. Everyone follows their inner light. It's not necessary to follow the Bible. It's not necessary to follow any other specific religious teaching. In fact, the inner light itself will reveal to each person, and each person's inner light must be respected. And this is a form of skepticism, because then what about all the traditional doctrines and teachings of Christianity? What about the Bible itself? What about the popes, the pastors, the priests, and all the other rulers of Christian Europe? If every person's inner light, if the uneducated person who cleans the gutters, right, if the inner light of such a person, a poor, uneducated woman, if their light speaks in a different way than all the popes and kings, that person, that light must be respected according to the Quakers. And you can see why this was very controversial. Quakers were often hanged because it was a kind of a revolutionary idea. We're talking about the 17th century, so 1600s and the 1700s. This is not a time, this is the beginnings of what will eventually, like I said, lead up to our Constitution and Declaration, but this is still in the very early stages. And this kind of skepticism address the Bible as well. Maybe it's just a human document. If we study it the same way we study all these other human documents. So you've heard of this group, this chapter talks about a group of people called humanists. These humanists are not modern humanists, like as is often used in religious terms for basically atheists, people who believe in nothing but the human being. But they're an earlier form of basically classical scholars who study the classics, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, ancient languages, and part of their studies sometimes it led them in very religious directions. So like Luther and Calvin and other leaders of the Protestant Reformation, as well as Catholics who addressed them, they were humanists. Some of them were humanist scholars, but other humanists just pointed in this direction of learning the classics, and as part of that, the Bible, as they study these ancient texts, one of the big questions is, can we study the Bible like we study any other ancient text? According to traditional Christian teaching, it is the Word of God, and it cannot be affected or altered in any way, and it is perfect. But if you study it as a human document, as these humanists did, as humanist teaching or the humanist way could encourage a person to do, you begin to uncover things that might challenge traditional ideas about inspiration. So this also was a piece and a part of the Enlightenment. And all of this, basically, if I could summarize everything I've said so far, you could say that what was happening was, one way to summarize or to think about it is, traditional Christianity was starting to be challenged in some very significant ways, especially going all the way up to the top, to the kings and the most educated people of Europe, by a form of an idea we can call deism. And deism is something that you have probably never heard of, but it was extremely important because deism is really the kind of first step towards true secularism. So like I said, if you really read Spinoza's writings, he sounds actually very religious by modern standards, by 21st century standards. He cares a lot about God. He's talking all the time about God and thinking about that God. But of course, his God is the universe, if you recall. He's just taken aback by the beauty of the universe and sees God in every atom and molecule in that sense, right? So deism is really that step that someone like Spinoza might be okay with. And again, not coincidentally, deism is the dominant religion of all the founding fathers of America. This is one reason why it's so difficult to answer questions like, does America count as a Christian nation, and these kind of things, because most of them were deists. And what does that mean? It means that there are different flavors of deism, but more or less deism is this idea, again, that God does not really interfere with the world, that the traditional Christian doctrines are not necessarily applied to God, that sure, there is a creator, but the simplest example that's often used is the watchmaker. God is like a watchmaker. He created this universe just like a watchmaker makes an intricate watch, and then he kind of steps back and the watch runs on its own. I mean, the watchmaker doesn't have to do anything. The watch just goes and goes and goes, and in that sense, then there's no use. There's not necessarily any use for prayer or any use for miracles or any of these kind of things. There is God, and as the text shows, there's kind of beautiful hymns to God. People are very interested in God, but Not in terms of personal intervention. Not so much like, well, God, I need you to really help my mom. She's sick right now. No, there may be even some sort. You may even think that the universe includes souls or includes punishment, life and death, after life and death. So Thomas Jefferson believed in these kind of things. He was a deist who believed had no problem with punishments for evil actions and rewards for good actions. But that's part of this kind of universe that just functions on its own without God's. You can't pray to God, please help me be good, or please help me get the rewards rather than the punishments. It's just up to you. It's part of this kind of natural, we might consider like karmic kind of balance or something like that. A kind of mechanism that works without an agent, without a person behind it. Okay, so this is Judaism, skepticism, atheism. And then we can talk about, again, some of these, the next section, social watersheds in Netherlands and England. This talks a little bit about the social changes that made all this possible. Basically, frankly, some of the first places where we see these really strong kind of Enlightenment voices is the Netherlands, right, with Spinoza, and also England, Locke and Hobbes and others. And these two, not coincidentally, are two of the wealthiest countries in Europe. And the first countries where people are getting rich and where people are getting to be what we would call now, again, something like a middle class is first emerging. Because there's some of the first industrial revolution, some of the pre coal, but the water wheel and these kind of things, and because of trade, because of the wealth of Dutch and British trade. And so the point is, with this kind of wealth, for the first time, people have leisure and excess money to consume. So things that only nobility probably would have had for most of history. A class of people, merchants, professionals like accountants and lawyers and these kind of people, may have the ability to enjoy leisure, to sit around and choose how they're going to spend their time and choose how they're going to spend their money. Do you like the blue silk scarf, or do you like the white woolen scarf? I mean, there's a lot of different choices now. And this affects religion in a very subtle way that's not always easy to see, but we can kind of see parts of it in what McCullough helpfully points out, is that in some of these places, for the first time, religious music is being played outside of a church or outside of a religious ceremony for pure enjoyment. Okay, and so do you call that religious or not? Is that secular or not? Well, it's tricky again, but you can see again some of these first steps toward what will become kind of a modern idea of secular, which is that I like religious music just for itself, just like you would listen now. This is the beginning of pop music, you could say. Listen to music for its own sake, not for religious sake, not to help edify the soul or call to mind some religious truth, but because it's nice to listen to and because people can choose to spend money that way. So for the first time, again, you can see kind of religion itself. You can see this idea. It hasn't really taken shape yet very much, but you can see this idea. Maybe religion is also a choice. Maybe you could choose your own religion, the way you choose a scarf, the way you choose to listen to music or not. And it's part of that kind of, instead of religion commanding what people should do, anybody in a nation being under the control of this religion, of this God, maybe the people are in control and they choose which God they will worship, or how they will worship, or even if they will worship. You see, there's a kind of inversion of ideas taking place because of social changes. And part of this is also gender. So we see these gender roles. In the Enlightenment period, actually, is a period where we're moving into modern forms of gender. If we think about male and female as distinct, separate classes, actually in the Middle Ages and before, because of a kind of classical, meaning Roman or Greek, medicine or science, so to speak, the natural philosophy that dominated, during the medieval ages and up to this period, actually, male and female were understood in terms of a spectrum, much closer to, again, more like 2020 in some ways. Gender is very much along the sides of a spectrum. The idea was that among the Romans or among the Greeks was always that the male was kind of the ideal human being, and the female was kind of a misshapen or not so fully formed man. I'm going to take a quick break right now.